The one place that intrigued me was my first trip to London and the House of Parliament in Big Ben. Now, these pictures, you must remember, are more than a quarter of a century old. Now, the thing that amused and entertained our boys who were stationed all over England was Westminster Abbey. And there were quite a few Americans who came there to see the sights and see Westminster Abbey. And these are the scenes that I wanted to photograph on one Sunday afternoon. Another area that intrigued me was Marble Arch. The Marble Arch on one Sunday afternoon was full of people. You must remember that London was being bombed almost every night in this particular time. I was photographing these speakers that were addressing the crowds. Every speaker was speaking on a different subject, but the police stood around and watched, and as long as there were no arguments, any strong arguments, nobody was hurt. The people in the audience were arguing back with the speakers. But these were just typical shots of how we passed the time waiting for D-Day. Most of the children who lived in England, or a great many I should say, were sent out of the city. But a lot of them had to remain behind. But in spite of a war, they managed to find entertainment. I was rather surprised to see these children drinking out of community drinking cups that were changed to the fountain. And I'd like to make candid shots of these children so they didn't notice me, but every once in a while they did. But this youngster is taking a cool drink on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Fleet Street. Discovered this Irish policeman guarding the street, and we saw considerable damage in the area. And we discovered that the St. Paul's Cathedral had been hit several times, but not badly damaged. And of course, one of the other attractions was Buckingham Palace and the gates, which were protected by British troops, not in the bearskin hats which they wore in peacetime, but in full war uniforms. And this is the way they paraded up and down. They weren't performing for the camera, but they were actually doing their duty. But you notice the barrage balloons in the background. London had barrage balloons all over the area. And it was said that if it wasn't for the barrage balloons, with all the equipment that was being brought into the country, that the islands would sink into the sea, but the barrage balloons, they said, was holding it up. You must remember, too, that food was pretty scarce in London at this time, and it was being brought in whatever way they could and being unloaded. It isn't often you get a bright day like this in the spring in London, and this was an opportunity to show what the soldiers were doing while they were waiting for the invasion. Practically every correspondent turned out to try to get into the city of Paris. But we found, as I said earlier, that the General Eisenhower had given permission to the 2nd French Armored Division to take the city of Paris, because the important thing was to destroy the enemy, and they didn't consider Paris as a target. It would delay them if they did try to take the city themselves. They wanted to circumvent the city because they wanted to give the honor to the French. We were glad to see Paris because it was a city of great beauty, and we were amazed at the way the people turned out. And these are some of the shots taken on the first day of liberation. I just didn't nearly get enough of these shots because there was too much to do. And soon General de Gaulle came into the city and paraded down the Champs-Élysées. And here he is taking the salute and receiving some flowers from a French girl. It must be remembered that de Gaulle was not well known at this time, and very few people could listen to the radio reports that told about his work in England prior to crossing the Channel. But soon he became very popular. It seemed as though everybody in Paris turned out to see de Gaulle. And he was marching down the Champs-Élysées at this point, and it was a tremendous sight to see. These are some shots made late in the day of the American troops marching through the streets of the city on their way to the front lines. Wherever we stopped, the French were there to trade champagne for cigarettes and to talk to us and find out what was going on. We were able to see the city. It wasn't badly destroyed. There was some small arms fire. The lion lost his tail, but generally speaking, all the bridges were intact over the city, and this is the Opera House. And since it was my first trip to Paris, I enjoyed seeing the beautiful city of Paris. Soon the people of Paris were out parading again along the Champs-Élysées with their newfound liberty. They even opened up the art galleries along the streets, and we didn't know whether they were permitted to do this prior to our getting there, but they certainly opened up for business very shortly after we arrived. We found a painter at work in the old quarter of Paris. These are some scenes of the Auteuil racetrack, which we found was opened shortly after the liberation. This surprised everyone, but they made them close the track after a few days of meeting. But one of the things that did surprise everyone is how well dressed the French women were, and they had a way of using whatever they had to make themselves look really attractive. And I understand this annoyed some of the other Allied countries very much, to think that they could get by like that. We discovered that the Eiffel Tower, which was reported destroyed and used for arms, was still intact. And soon I managed to get permission to go up into the Eiffel Tower and see what it looked like from up above. But there was much to be done, and even though Paris looked beautiful, conditions were very poor. The railroads were practically destroyed. There was no way of bringing in food. In fact, when we were coming down the road, we saw large trucks waiting to get into the city, loaded with all kinds of foodstuffs to support the city, which was in dire need not only of food but of coal, because at this time it was getting pretty cold. It was late in the year, and there was no way of getting supplies in. These are scenes from the Eiffel Tower showing the Seine and the buildings close to the Eiffel Tower. We see some troops parading through the streets.